My 8-year-old daughter spent her cousin's party in the kitchen. They told her she wasn't dressed nicely enough to be out front. She cried in the car. I didn't argue, I didn't shout. I just took something from the drawer and made them regret everything. My name is Mara Collins. I'm 31 years old. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a utility bill and a credit card offer. It was so thick and heavy it felt less like paper and more like a small, flat weapon. The cardstock was the color of expensive cream and the text was embossed in shimmering gold foil. It announced the 8th birthday party of my niece, Ava, daughter of my brother, Caleb Collins, but this wasn't just any party invitation. At the bottom, in an elegant, looping script, was the theme, a symphony in neutrals, for an 8-year-old's birthday. A symphony in beige, taupe, and muted gray. My own daughter, Mia, who was also 8, saw it and her eyes lit up like a pinball machine. She couldn't read the pretentious calligraphy, so she just saw the magic words, party, cousin, cake. She danced around our small living room, her pigtails flying, a whirlwind of pure, uncomplicated joy. I, on the other hand, felt a familiar, cold dread settle in my stomach. I saw the invitation for what it was, a list of rules disguised as a theme. A social test I was, as always, doomed to fail. The dress code was a quiet, perfectly aimed jab. Caleb and his wife, Catherine, knew my budget. They knew I worked part-time as a receptionist and that my life was a constant, careful balancing act of bills and groceries. They knew I couldn't just go out and buy a brand new sand-colored linen dress for Mia on a whim. This was their world, the one Caleb had built, curated, expensive, and a color palette that had no room for the vibrant, sometimes messy, reality of our lives. Mia had a dress she adored, a treasure we'd found at a high-end consignment shop a few months ago. It was second-hand, but it was beautiful, a blush pink confection with a tulle skirt that fanned out when she twirled. I had saved for 3 months to buy it for her. $128 felt like a fortune, but the look on her face when she tried it on had been worth every penny. She called it her princess ballerina dress, and it was her favorite thing in the world. It was her armor, her fantasy, her joy, all stitched into one garment. I told myself that blush was close enough to neutral. It was a soft, pale pink. Surely, it wouldn't be a problem. This is a habit of mine, a survival mechanism I'd developed over the years, telling myself small lies to get through the day, to believe that this time, maybe this time, I wouldn't be judged. The theme of neutral tones was a perfect stand-in for their entire life philosophy. Blend in, be seamless, don't make a fuss, don't show any messy color. The blush dress, I realized with a sigh, was a perfect motif for everything Mia and I were. Full of life and color, a little worn around the edges and clearly, hopelessly out of place in their world. But when I zipped her into it that Saturday morning and tied the satin sash at her back, I saw how her whole face lit up. Her smile was so bright it could have powered the city, and in that moment that was all that mattered. We arrived at Caleb's mansion, a sprawling minimalist monument to his success. It was all clean lines, glass walls, and acres of perfectly manicured lawn that looked like it had been trimmed with scissors. Inside, a sea of children in shades of oatmeal, ecru, and dove gray played quiet, organized games. It looked less like a child's birthday party and more like a cult for tiny accountants. Catherine, my sister-in-law, spotted us immediately. Her eyes flickered down to Mia's dress, and her smile, which was already a tight, polite line, seemed to shrink by half. "Oh, Mara," she said, her voice a carefully constructed blend of pity and disappointment. The theme was neutrals. Before I could even formulate a response, she bent down to Mia, her voice sickeningly sweet. "Your dress is so bright, you know what would be a fun game?" She took my daughter's hand, gently but firmly pulling her away from the group of children who were now staring. She didn't lead her to a bedroom to change or to a playroom with other toys. She led her toward the back of the house, toward the swinging door of the industrial-sized kitchen. "She can help the caterers hand out napkins." "It'll be fun," Catherine said over her shoulder, as if she were offering Mia a pony. I stood frozen, watching my 8-year-old daughter in her beautiful blush dress that I had saved months for get escorted into service with the hired help. Her job for the party was to be useful and invisible because her clothes weren't the right shade of beige. I didn't scream. I didn't make a scene. I just stood there, a ghost in their perfect neutral world, and felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. Mia was quiet in the car on the way home. She stared out the window, tracing patterns on the fogged-up glass with her little finger. After about 10 minutes of silence, she asked in a small voice, "Mom, is pink a bad color?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "No, honey, pink is a wonderful color. The dress was perfect. You were perfect." The lie tasted like ash in my mouth. She had spent 2 hours handing tiny, beige napkins to adults who didn't even look at her, while Ava opened a mountain of tastefully wrapped gifts. I drove past blocks of normal houses with patchy lawns and colorful swing sets rusting in the yards. I saw families grilling in their backyards, kids laughing and shouting. Every mile that separated us from Caleb's sterile, silent mansion felt like coming up for air after being held underwater. The humiliation wasn't a big, dramatic event. It was never like that with my family. It was 1,000 quiet cuts, a constant stream of subtle reminders that we didn't belong, that we weren't enough. This was just the deepest cut I'd ever received. By the time we got home, the hard knot in my stomach wasn't just anger anymore. It had cooled and hardened into something else. It was fuel. I tucked Mia into bed, read her an extra story, and kissed her forehead. Then I walked over to the old, scuffed-up desk in the corner of my living room. With a deep breath, I reached down and pulled open the bottom drawer. The one I never, ever touched. The drawer smelled like old paper, forgotten dreams, and the faintest hint of baby powder. Inside was the life I had before I learned to expect less, before I learned to make myself small. My fingers brushed against a folded piece of fabric and I pulled it out. It was the prototype. A hand-stitched, quilted sleep mat, soft and worn from use. I could almost feel the phantom weight of my exhaustion from those early days. I remembered the nights I'd sat on this very floor, stitching it together while a colicky, screaming baby Mia finally slept in her swing. I'd been desperate for anything that would give us both a few hours of peace. My fingers traced the weighted corners, designed to give a gentle, calming pressure. I touched the different textured ribbons I'd sewn along the edge for her tiny hands to grip. I felt the small, empty pocket where I used to slip in a little white noise module that played the sound of rain. It was all there, my solution born from a mother's desperation and love. Beneath the mat were sketches on graph paper, my own handwriting detailing every feature with meticulous notes. And under those, I found the receipt from the pharmacy photo kiosk. It was for a single 4x6 print of Mia, just 6 weeks old, finally sleeping peacefully on the mat I'd made. The date was stamped clearly in purple ink at the top, 8 years ago, and then I found the email. The one I'd printed out for some reason I couldn't remember, the one I'd sent to Caleb, full of hope and excitement. "I think this could be something," I'd written. "Let me know what you think." I remembered Caleb's response to that email as if it were yesterday. He hadn't bothered to write back. He'd called me a day later, his voice amused and patronizing. "It's cute, Mara, really, but a blanket is just a blanket." He'd been so condescending, so dismissive. It was the way he always was when I had an idea that wasn't about supporting one of his. He made me feel small and foolish for even thinking I could have a concept worthy of his world. 3 years later, he launched the Soothe Nest. It was my design with a fancier logo and his name plastered everywhere. The weighted corners were there, the sensory ribbons, even a sleek, upgraded white noise player. The world and our family called him a genius. An innovator who understood the needs of modern parents. I tried to bring it up just once at a family dinner shortly after his launch. I'd said, "That looks so much like the mat I made for Mia." My mom, Evelyn, had given me a sharp, warning look across the table. Later in the kitchen, she'd pulled me aside and hissed, "Don't be jealous, Mara, it's not a good look. An idea isn't the same as building a business." they had erased me from my own story. They had gaslighted me into believing I was petty and envious for recognizing my own work. Holding the cold, hard proof in my hands, the sketches, the dated receipt, the hopeful email, I realized they hadn't just dismissed an idea. They had dismissed me, my work, my creativity, my motherhood. It was all just a cute little hobby until a man decided to make it profitable. My neighbor, Nora Patel, is a freelance graphic designer who lives in the apartment next to mine. She's tough, smart, and has a finely tuned nonsense detector. The next morning, I saw her on her small balcony watering a row of chili plants. I was still running on the fumes of my cold anger from the night before, and before I knew it, I was just talking. The words spilled out of me like a dam breaking. I told her everything: the blush dress, the kitchen, the condescending pity from Catherine. Then I told her about the drawer, the sleep mat, and Caleb's billion-dollar idea. I braced myself for the usual reaction, a polite nod, a suggestion that it was probably a coincidence, the kind of gentle dismissal I'd come to expect from the world. But Nora didn't do that. She stopped watering her plants and turned to face me, her expression hardening. She didn't treat me like I was crazy or jealous. She got angry for me. "Creators get ripped off all the time," she said, her voice sharp. "But by your own family, that's vile, Mara, absolutely vile." Hearing someone else validate my reality, someone outside my own head, felt like a door cracking open in a dark room. It was the first time I felt like I might not be completely alone in this. She told me about a lawyer she knew, a guy named Jordan Pike. She said he was young, hungry, and sometimes took on cases for artists and independent creators for free if the evidence was solid enough. "He doesn't like bullies," Nora said, pulling a junk mail envelope from her recycling bin and scribbling his name and number on the back with a pen from her pocket. She handed it to me. The paper felt heavy, significant. It wasn't just a phone number, it was permission to fight back. Jordan Pike's office was the polar opposite of my brother's world. It was a small, cluttered space above a pizza shop that smelled faintly of garlic. Books and files were stacked in precarious towers on every available surface. But Jordan himself had a sharp, focused energy that cut through the chaos. He was younger than I expected, with kind eyes that seemed to see right through the nervous tremor in my hands. I laid everything out on his desk: the prototype mat, the sketches on graph paper, the dated photo receipt, and the printout of my email to Caleb. He examined each piece silently, his expression unreadable. He picked up the photo receipt and held it to the light, studying the date stamp. Then he looked up at me. "The paper trail is good," he said, his voice calm and even. He was careless. "He probably never imagined you'd keep all this." He was clear from the start. He wasn't promising a big, dramatic courtroom battle that would end with a gavel slam. He said those things rarely happen in real life. What he promised was leverage. "We use what you have to make them uncomfortable," he explained. "To create a problem that's easier and cheaper for them to solve by paying you than by fighting you." He drafted a simple, blunt letter to Caleb's company. There was no emotional language, no accusations of betrayal. It was just facts laid out in cold, black and white. It cited the detailed design specifications in my email from 8 years ago, the date-stamped photograph of the prototype in use, and the subsequent launch date of the remarkably similar Soothe Nest product. It was a formal demand for acknowledgement of my contribution and financial compensation. We sent it via certified mail so we'd have proof they received it. It felt like launching a single, small stone at a fortress. I expected a formal, sterile response from his lawyers. Instead, the first shot fired was answered by a phone call from Caleb himself, and he was laughing. "Mara, what is this?" he chuckled into the phone. "Is this some kind of joke?" Caleb's laughter faded pretty quickly when I told him I had a lawyer and put Jordan on the line. Jordan's voice was calm and professional, and he simply stated that no, this was not a joke. The official response came a day later, not from Caleb, but from a sleek downtown law firm. It was an offer, but it wasn't a negotiation. It was an insult. They offered me $25,000, contingent on me signing a non-disclosure agreement that would forbid me from ever speaking about this to anyone ever again. Hush money, it was a blatant admission of guilt, thinly veiled as a nuisance payment. They thought they could buy my silence, my story, my entire experience for the price of a mid-range sedan. They thought I was so desperate, so beaten down, that I'd snatch the check and disappear quietly. The offer wasn't just insulting, it was clarifying. It proved this wasn't some cosmic coincidence or a simple misunderstanding. This was a calculated, deliberate theft, and they knew it. Jordan called me to discuss it. "This is their opening bid," he advised. "It's a lowball, but it means they're taking it seriously." But I didn't see it as an opening bid. I saw it as a declaration of war. They had just confirmed everything I feared. They saw me as a problem to be managed, a loose end to be tied up. "No," I said to Jordan, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "Tell them no." I told him to send back our terms, the ones I had written down on a legal pad the night after Ava's party, fueled by rage and 2 cups of coffee, $420,000 up front. It wasn't a random number. I had spent hours calculating what I'd need to pay off my debts, put a real down payment on a small house, and start a college fund for Mia. It was the price of a stable life, the kind Caleb had taken for granted. 3% royalties on the Soothe Nest line for 5 years because I deserved to share in the ongoing success of what I had created. And the last term, the most important one, my name. My name as co-creator on the packaging and on any new patent filings. That, I told Jordan, was completely non-negotiable. After our counteroffer was sent, a heavy silence fell for 2 days. Then my phone started ringing. It wasn't Caleb and it wasn't his lawyers. It was my mother. Her voice, when I answered, was strained and tight, dripping with a profound sense of disappointment that she had perfected over my lifetime. "Mara, what are you doing to your brother?" she asked, not as a question but as an accusation. She didn't ask for my side of the story. She didn't ask to see my proof. She already had a story, the one Caleb had surely fed her. According to Mom, I was a bitter, jealous sister trying to tear down his incredible success because I was unhappy with my own life. She talked about the family's reputation, about how this would look to their friends, about the shame I was bringing on all of them. "He offered you money, Mara," she said, her voice full of disbelief, as if that fact should have been the end of it. As if a check could heal the wound. "A generous amount of money. Why can't you just accept it and let this go? Why do you always have to make things so difficult?" It was the family mantra, the one I'd been hearing for 31 years. Smooth things over, don't make waves, protect the golden boy at all costs. My own mother was acting as his agent, his enforcer, sent to emotionally manipulate me into submission. In that moment, the true depth of my isolation became terrifyingly clear. I was completely and utterly alone in this. The pressure was immense, a physical weight on my chest. It felt like the walls of my own history were closing in on me, but this time something was different. This time I didn't crumble. I took a deep breath. "Mom," I said, my voice surprisingly calm, "this is between me and Caleb's company now. I'm not going to discuss it with you." I heard her gasp on the other end of the line, but before she could launch into another tirade, I said, "I have to go," and hung up the phone. My hand was shaking, but for the first time in my life I hadn't backed down. That phone call with my mother shifted everything inside me. The fight was no longer just about a sleep mat. It was about my very place in the family I had been born into. Caleb's offer of hush money proved he knew he was in the wrong, but he had made the arrogant assumption that my silence, my integrity, had a price tag, and a cheap one at that. My mother's call proved that the family's loyalty was a one-way street, flowing directly and unconditionally to Caleb, the son who produced success and status. The real problem, I was beginning to understand, wasn't that Caleb stole my idea. The problem was that my family had spent 3 decades creating an environment where he was not only allowed to, but was implicitly encouraged to. Theirs was a simple system. Caleb provides the success, the money, the gleaming public image, and the rest of us provide the scaffolding of support and endless admiration. My claim wasn't just a request for credit. It was a wrecking ball aimed at the foundation of that system. I was no longer playing my assigned role as the quiet, supportive, overlooked sister. I was disrupting the entire fragile ecosystem. This backfire, the family immediately rallying around him instead of even asking to hear the truth, made everything sharper, clearer. I wasn't just taking on Caleb and his corporation. I was taking on my entire family structure and the story they told themselves about who they were. I finally, truly understood that there was no going back to the way things were. The polite fiction of our happy family was shattered for good. I met with Jordan again the next day in his cluttered office. I told him about the phone call from my mother, about the accusations of jealousy and her pleas to protect the family name. He leaned back in his creaky chair and nodded slowly, not surprised in the least. "This is what they do," he said. "This is step one in the playbook. They isolate you, they try to make you feel like you're the crazy one." His calm validation was like a lifeline. He was right. The stakes were no longer just financial, they were profoundly personal. If I backed down now, if I took their next lowball offer and signed their papers, I would be confirming their narrative for the rest of my life. I would be officially cementing my role as the jealous, difficult sister who made a fuss over nothing. More than that, I would be teaching my daughter, Mia, a terrible lesson. I'd be teaching her that when someone powerful wrongs you, especially if they're family, you accept whatever scraps they throw your way and you stay quiet. I couldn't live with that. I wouldn't. The fear was real, the fear of being completely disowned, of being permanently cast out and vilified. It was a primal, terrifying thought, but the image of Mia, her bright, trusting eyes watching me, was stronger. I had to see this through, no matter what. Jordan said Caleb's side would probably go quiet for a bit while they tried to figure out their next move. "They think you'll lose your nerve," he warned. I looked out his dusty window at the street below. I wouldn't. The goal wasn't just about the money or the credit anymore. It was about being believed. A few days of tense silence passed. The quiet was unnerving, making me second-guess myself with every passing hour. Then, an email landed in my inbox from an anonymous, encrypted address. The subject line contained just one word. "Soothe Nest?" My heart started pounding against my ribs, my hands trembled as I clicked it open. The message was short, just a few sentences. "He stole it. I know he did. I used to work for him. He does this all the time." I felt a jolt, a dizzying mix of terror and vindication. I wrote back immediately, my fingers flying across the keyboard. "Who is this? How do you know?" The reply came an hour later. Her name was Tessa Morgan. She had been Caleb's personal assistant for the first 2 years of the company, right when he was getting everything off the ground. She said she'd finally quit because she couldn't stand his ethics or lack thereof. She couldn't watch him constantly take credit for other people's work and pass it off as his own spontaneous genius. Then she wrote the line that changed everything: "He has a genius folder on his hard drive. It's filled with ideas he gets from other people, emails, pitches, things he sees online. Yours was in there, I remember it." This was it. The first piece of hard proof from inside his world. Someone else knew, someone else had seen it. I wasn't crazy, I hadn't imagined it. The relief was so overwhelming it almost brought me to my knees. Tessa Morgan agreed to a phone call. Her voice was nervous, shaky at first, but as she talked, a current of quiet resolve ran underneath it. She told me about an early investor deck Caleb had put together to get his first round of seed funding. It was a presentation he showed to potential backers to convince them to give him money. "He was sloppy back then," she said, a hint of disdain in her voice. "He was in a huge hurry to look legitimate. He needed visuals fast to prove his concept was viable." She told me to look at slide 7 of the presentation. The proof of concept slide. After we hung up, she sent another encrypted email. Attached was a password-protected PDF file. The body of the email contained only the password. My idea, the irony was so bitter it almost made me laugh. I downloaded the file, typed in the password, and the presentation opened on my screen. My breath caught in my throat. I clicked through the first few slides, market analysis, financial projections, until I got to slide 7. And there it was, A picture of a baby sleeping soundly on a quilted mat. It was my photo. The one I'd had printed at the pharmacy 8 years ago. He had cropped it and put some kind of warm, glossy filter over it to make it look professional, but it was unmistakably mine. I recognized the specific pattern of the stitching, the way the light hit the fabric, but he'd made a mistake. In his haste, he had failed to crop the image tightly enough. In the bottom right corner, just at the edge of the frame, you could still see it. A tiny baby's hand, my Mia's hand, curled tightly around one of the textured ribbons I had sewn on for her. It was undeniable. It was everything. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial Jordan's number. I told him I was sending him something and that he needed to open it immediately. I emailed him the file and the password. I heard the click of his mouse and then there was a long, charged silence on his end of the line. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and full of a new intensity. "This is it, Mara," he said. "This is the smoking gun." He explained how this changed everything. With this, it was no longer a case of he said, she said. It wasn't just a family dispute over a coincidentally similar idea anymore. This was documented, willful infringement. This was proof that he had not only seen my idea but had actively used my own photograph of my own child to secure funding for the company he built on it. He asked me what I wanted to do with it. We had options. We could send it directly to Caleb's lawyer and almost certainly force an immediate and much larger settlement, but I knew that wouldn't be enough. They would bury it. They would pay me, force me to sign an airtight NDA and spin some corporate-approved story if it ever came out. The truth would remain their secret. I thought about my mother's voice on the phone accusing me of jealousy. I thought about Mia standing alone in that sterile kitchen. "No," I said, a new hard resolve crystallizing inside me. "I want to burn the bridge." This was my commitment, no more quiet private negotiations. It was time for public pressure. I knew in that instant that it meant there was no turning back, no possibility of reconciliation. I was choosing to escalate, to make it impossible for them to hide this away in a quiet drawer of their own. This was the moment I stopped being a victim of their story and started being a threat to it. Jordan knew a blogger. Her name was Lena Brooks, and she ran a small but fiercely independent site that covered startup culture with a special focus on founder controversies and intellectual property disputes. She had a reputation for being thorough and for protecting her sources. We made a calculated decision. We didn't give her the whole investor deck and we didn't give her my name. We gave her just one thing. A heavily cropped and blurred version of Slide 7. It was just enough to be tantalizingly incriminating. You could make out the corner of the photograph, the distinctive Soothe Nest Company logo in the header, and the slide's title. Proof of concept. Lena Brooks ran it with a sharp, provocative headline, "Whispers of Idea Theft at Soothe Nest, Sources Share Internal Pitch Deck." She didn't name me, she didn't have to. The post was a small fire, but in the echo chamber of the internet, small fires could spread fast. It was a start. The clock was now officially ticking, and the story was, for the first time, in the open, even if it wasn't yet fully my own. We had lit the fuse, and now we had to be ready for the explosion. The post went up on a Friday afternoon. By Saturday morning, my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, but I knew who it was. I answered. It was Caleb. And he wasn't laughing anymore. Caleb's call wasn't an apology, it was a demand, his voice tight with fury. "What did you do?" he hissed into the phone. He didn't say, "How could you think I stole from you?" He said, "What did you do?" He wasn't angry that he had wronged me. He was furious that I had told someone. In that single, clarifying moment, the major truth of my life flipped into sharp, painful focus. The problem wasn't just Caleb, it was never just Caleb. It was the entire family system, meticulously designed and maintained over decades to protect him, to elevate him, to excuse him. They weren't just bystanders to my erasure, they were active participants. My silence was the price of admission to my own family. My quiet compliance was the glue that held their perfect picture of themselves together. They didn't see a brother who had stolen a desperate mother's invention. They saw a sister who was threatening the family's primary asset, Caleb's shimmering success. This was a complete reversal of my entire understanding of my life. For years, I thought I was trying to get my family to see the truth. I finally realized I wasn't appealing to a family for justice. I was fighting a system that was built on my silence, a system that required me to be small so that Caleb could be big. The blog post was out there. The first crack in their perfect facade was visible. In that moment, with Caleb breathing threats on the other end of the line, I had a choice. I could use the post as a new, powerful piece of leverage. I could force a quick, quiet, and much bigger settlement. Take the money, sign the non-disclosure agreement, and disappear. That was the safe option. It was the option my family expected, the one that would let them put this ugly story back in its box and nail it shut. Or I could lean into it. I could make it real. I thought of Tessa Morgan, the former assistant, risking a lawsuit to send me that file. I thought of Lena Brooks, the blogger, putting her name and reputation on the line to publish the story. Most of all, I thought of Mia, my sweet daughter, looking up at me in the car and asking if pink was a bad color. My irreversible choice was made in that instant, a decision that felt less like a thought and more like a physical realignment of my own spine. I would not be silenced. I would not sign their papers. I would not take their money in exchange for their secret. I held the phone to my ear and said to my brother, my voice calm and clear, I did what I had to do. Then I hung up on him. I wasn't just ending a phone call, I was hanging up on the role they had given me for 31 years. The role of the quiet one, the easy one, the one who never made a fuss. That person was gone. I knew exactly what this choice would cost me. It would cost me my family. There would be no more awkward holiday dinners where I smiled politely while being ignored. There would be no more stilted birthday parties where I felt like an outsider. There would simply be nothing. I was accepting the role they had already cast for me, the villain in their story. I was the difficult one, the ungrateful one, the one who ruined everything. The personal cost was immense. It was the sudden, sharp grief for a family I was realizing I never really had in the first place. I was mourning the idea of them. I was mourning the mother who would never defend me, the father who would never stand up for me, and the brother I once thought I loved. It was a profound, aching loss that settled deep in my bones. But beneath the grief, something else was stirring, a strange, unfamiliar sense of freedom. It was the freedom from constantly trying and failing to earn their approval. The freedom from biting my tongue until it bled. The freedom from shrinking myself to fit into the tiny, airless space they had allotted me. I accepted the cost because the price of staying silent was so much higher. The price was my self-respect. It was my daughter's future. I was choosing to be an outcast with my integrity intact over being an insider who had sold her own story for a quiet life. I called Jordan. I told him my decision. No non-disclosure agreement. Full public credit as co-creator. All of our original terms still stood firm and unyielding. My goal was now restated, bolder and infinitely riskier than it had been before. This was never really about the money. The money was a tool. It was stability for Mia. It was a roof over our heads that didn't leak. It was freedom from the constant, grinding stress of poverty. But it wasn't the goal. The real goal, the one that had been hiding under all the anger and hurt, was to have the truth put on the public record. I wanted my name on that box. I wanted my name on the patent. I wanted every exhausted new mother who bought a soothe nest in the middle of the night to know that another exhausted new mother had created it. I wanted to dismantle the myth of the lone male genius that my family and his public relations team had so carefully constructed around Caleb. The risk was enormous. I knew they could countersue me for defamation. They could launch a vicious smear campaign. They could drag this out for years and bury me in legal fees I could never hope to pay. But the plan was no longer just to get a settlement. The plan was to take back my name. The antagonist retaliated, but not with lawyers, not at first. They used the weapon they had always wielded with the most skill: family. My mother called again. This time her tone wasn't angry or accusatory. It was worse. It was pleading, heavy with a manufactured sorrow that was meant to break my heart. "We're having a family dinner," she said, her voice thick with false warmth. "This Sunday, just us, your father and I, you and Caleb, no lawyers. It's time to sit down as a family and end this." It was a trap disguised as an olive branch. A peace summit held on their turf under their rules. It was a final, desperate attempt to handle me, to use the illusion of family love to put me back in my place. Jordan warned me against it immediately. "It's an ambush, Mara," he said bluntly over the phone. "They're going to corner you and emotionally blackmail you. Don't go." He was right, of course, but I knew I had to go. If I refused, they would twist it. They would use my absence as definitive proof that I was the unreasonable one, the one unwilling to seek peace. I had to walk into the lion's den not to negotiate, but to show them that their old tactics, their guilt, and their performance of family obligation wouldn't work on me anymore. "I'm going," I told Jordan. I promised him I would be calm, I would be factual, and I would not back down an inch. This was their decisive retaliation, and I had to face it head-on. I walked into that house like someone stepping into a stage set where every detail had been rehearsed to make me feel small. The hallway smelled like lemon cleaner and waxed wood, Mom's favorite scent for company, and it hit me the second I opened the door. Dad met me at the entrance with a hug that felt like a perfunctory ritual. He held me for a second and said my name in a way that sounded practiced, not warm. Mom hovered behind him, her smile tight. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Caleb and Catherine were already on the couch, the way people sit on thrones, their posture saying they were comfortably in control. They had arranged the living room just so. Neutral throw pillows, a pale rug, a lamp without a lampshade because a lampshade would have meant personality. The air carried the sound of polite conversation, the kind that stays just above anger but under the skin. They served roast chicken that night, the kind of dinner Mom used to make when she wanted to remind us of what normal looked like. The smell should have felt like comfort. Instead, it was a calculated gesture, an attempt to anchor the evening in nostalgia. Every plate that hit the table felt like part of the performance. The tableware was crisp, the napkins folded with surgical precision. The house hummed with curated calm, and I felt like an intruder in a memory that had been repainted without me. Every family photo on the wall looked at me like evidence. The couch I had jumped on as a kid seemed to whisper, "Remember your place." Even the clock on the mantel ticked with the rhythm of judgment. I realized with a cold, slow clarity that the safe space of my childhood, those bland, comforting rituals and familiar smells, had been turned into a weapon. They were using the story of home to try to shame me back to silence. The place that once held my messy, ordinary life had been sterilized and set as a trap. When I sat down, I felt exposed. The warmth that had once been there was gone. I listened to the soft clatter of silverware and felt the old ache of being the one who had to apologize even when she was right. It was clear this dinner wasn't about peace. It was about performance, about showing me what I'd lose if I kept pushing. I breathed in and steadied myself. I wasn't the scared kid anymore. I had my proof, and even if the room wanted to swallow me whole, I would not disappear. They didn't need to shout to start the character assassination. Mom began, slow and steady, with that voice that had been rehearsed for years to convey disappointment in one breath. "Mara, this is so hurtful," she said, as if my asking for my name on a product was the same thing as stomping on their family's good name. Her words were sugar-coated and meant to stick. Caleb leaned forward, his expression perfectly wounded. "I don't understand why you're doing this," he said, the kind of line that pretended he was bewildered by my audacity and hurt by it in the same sentence. He placed his hand over his heart like he was offering proof of being wounded. "I worked hard. I built something. You're accusing me of taking from you." His voice was controlled, sorrowful in a way that asked for sympathy rather than accountability. Dad folded his hands on his lap and with that quiet, measured tone he used when he wanted to sound reasonable, said, "Your brother built a company that employs 50 people, Mara. Think about the people who rely on him." Not once did he ask to see the evidence I'd brought. Not once did he ask who the people were that would lose their jobs if the truth came out. It was a tactic of moral math. My claim versus other people's livelihoods. The implication was clear: my grievance was a threat to a bigger good, and therefore I was the problem. They stacked their narrative like bricks. I was painted as unstable, reckless, and bitter. Caleb framed himself as a victim of my supposed vendetta, and Mom added reverence about family reputation like a final varnish. Each sentence was a small, precise blade meant to cut my story into something unrecognizable. It wasn't ugly screaming, it was a slow erasure done with velvet gloves. They were rehearsing the version of events they'd tell friends and colleagues, the story where I was a disgruntled sister making trouble. I let them lay it out. It hurt like 100 tiny pricks, but I needed to hear it all so I could name it for what it was. Their words were not facts, they were a script. I didn't interrupt, I didn't fight back with heat. I let their accusations land and then sit there on the table like evidence. For the first time, I listened to them not as family trying to reach me, but as opponents trying to win. That shifted something solid and terrible into focus. They were united and prepared to burn me to preserve the image they preferred. When they finished, there was a small, expectant silence, as if everyone was waiting for me to break. The room held its breath, ready for my collapse, my apology, the performance of regret. Instead, I felt something inside me harden. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't cry. I looked at each of them, the practiced anger in Caleb's jaw, the relieved softness on Mom's face, Dad's neutral, businesslike expression, and I spoke with a calm that surprised even me. "You used my photograph in your investor deck," I said, and I slid the printed slide across to the middle of the table, right where everyone could see it. The photo had a faint gloss, the little corner cropped, but the ribbon detail was unmistakable. I looked at Mom. "Humiliation is watching your child be sent to the kitchen to be invisible," I said. The words landed like stones. I could see the tiny flinches. They had wanted me to be undone by guilt, to be softened by family memory. I named the hurt they'd tried to hide under platitudes. I looked at Dad. "The 50 people you mentioned are working for a company built on something you didn't build," I said. "If you want to defend them, defend the truth first." I looked at Caleb last. "My name goes on the box, my name goes on the patent. The money is not charity, it's my labor accounted for. Those are my terms." Caleb didn't meet my eyes. He had the kind of anger that tasted like entitlement. He barked out a quick, furious, "Fine," more to his lawyer than me, and the lawyers began to shuffle papers as if the end of dinner was a contract signing. The air in the room thinned. The polished mask of family civility crumbled into something brittle. I stood up. I didn't shout, I didn't beg. I simply said, "This conversation is over," and walked out. I left them with their stunned faces and their tidy versions of history. When I opened the front door and felt the cold air hit my face, I felt something unbreakable inside me settle into place. They'd created a wall to hold me out, and instead of knocking myself against it, I had decided to become something else on the other side. The next day, the betrayal sharpened into something colder. I hadn't expected a text from Dad. I expected him to be at least conflicted, to ask to see the files, to say something that let me know he was still my father beneath the business logic. Instead, his message was short, crisp, and merciless. "Take the next offer," it read. "Be smart, don't ruin the family's name over pride." The words hit like a door slamming. He didn't call, he didn't ask questions. He issued an order, the kind of announcement you might expect from someone overseeing property, not from someone who had once called me at 2 in the morning because I'd had a fever and couldn't breathe. The father I had carried in my memory, quiet, tentative, capable of tenderness, had been replaced by an investor making a cold calculation. It wasn't even about Caleb's needs, exactly. It was about optics and risk and the bottom line. Dad's text treated our family like a balance sheet, reputation as an asset, me as a liability. I felt a sick, hot betrayal seep into my bones. My father was not just choosing Caleb, he was choosing a version of our family that excluded me entirely. He was prioritizing what the world thought over what I had been through. With that single text, any lingering possibility that the family might choose truth over comfort died. There was no longer anyone in that house who would stand between me and the consequences of pushing back. The idea that I could appeal to Dad's sense of fairness evaporated. He had quietly, efficiently removed himself from the role of protector. It was brutal and clarifying. If Dad could be so easily persuaded by the gravity of public image, then there was no court of family that would ever favor me. The last safe option, the one where someone I loved would see the documents and simply believe me, was gone. The isolation wasn't theoretical anymore, it was a fact laid out in black and white on my phone. I stared at the message until the words blurred. Part of me grieved for what I'd hoped Dad might be, but another part of me hardened. If no one in my family would stand up for the truth, I would have to build the case alone outside the house that used to be my anchor. The knowledge was terrifying and liberating at once. There was no turning back to family dinners and polite placations. There was only forward into a fight that I could no longer expect anyone at home to share. Lena Brooks called Jordan the next morning. She'd gotten an anonymous tip that had more to it than our little blurred image. Her voice over the phone was steady, sharp. "There's more," she said. "Soothnest is about to sign a major deal with a national baby retail chain. It's a huge placement, end caps, featured product, the works. They've got a clause that says the brand has to be, and I quote, transparent and ethically sourced on origin stories. If this gets messy, that deal evaporates." Hearing that, everything that had been moving slowly turned into a sprint. The whisper in a blog post was no longer an annoyingly loud rumor, it was a real threat to someone's bottom line. Caleb couldn't afford a long fight, not if he wanted that chain to take him seriously. Not if he wanted the glossy lifestyle influencers to keep praising him. Suddenly, the stakes weren't just about family pride. They were about money that could vanish overnight and the kind of public questions no public relations team wants. Jordan's posture changed. He was always calm, but now he was tight like a wire ready to snap. "They'll try a new tactic," he said frankly. "Expect a bigger offer, expect pressure, expect then the other stuff, lawsuits, character attacks. They'll try to make this about you, not about what he did." I thought of the party and of Mia's little hand on the ribbon in that photo. I thought of the nights sewing on the floor and the tired comfort of that mat. The ticking clock that had been present since Lena's first post moved faster. It felt like a weight in my stomach and a fuel at the same time. This wasn't a slow burn anymore. It was a timed fuse. We made a plan that same afternoon. It was risky and brutal in its clarity. We would give Caleb's lawyers a deadline, 48 hours. They either met our terms in full or we handed over the unblurred slide and Tessa's willingness to back up everything she'd told me to Lena Brooks. No more hints of anonymity. We would go public with the real thing. Jordan leaned across his cluttered desk and warned me again. "If they call our bluff, you know what they'll do," he said. "They'll scream extortion and they'll try to drag you through the mud. They'll sue to scare you into silence. They'll say you conspired with a disgruntled former assistant to blackmail your brother." That's what big fights look like. I pictured the letter my mother would send, the disappointed tones she'd use, the way Dad might quietly pick sides. I pictured the glossy headlines painting me as a villain. But I also pictured Mia, clean and sleeping on a mat I'd made. I pictured every mother who'd ever stayed up at night rocking a screaming infant and wishing for a small, honest solution. That image weighed more than the threat. "Do it," I told Jordan. "Send the email." He typed, sent, and then we waited. The 48 hours felt like a long, hot summer where everything was possible and everything could burn. I kept busy cleaning, cooking, walking in circles with my hands stuffed in my pockets, but the waiting gnawed at me. Then the courier showed up. I hadn't expected a uniformed man to hand me an envelope like a verdict. He stood in the hallway, stone-faced, and handed over a thick packet that smelled faintly of expensive paper. The envelope had a downtown law firm's return address. I felt my knees go weak. I slid it open with a letter opener like a prop in a bad movie. Inside was not a check or a note of apology. It was a stack of legal papers, formal, sharp, and cold. A cease and desist letter was on top, telling me to stop talking about their client and to remove the posts. Beneath it was the draft of a lawsuit. The words were dense but clear. They were accusing me of defamation, of trying to damage Caleb's business, of working with Tessa to extort money. They were accusing me of making a deal with a disgruntled former employee to conspire to ruin him. They were saying I'd launched a coordinated campaign to pressure their client for money. It was an ugly story they were writing about me, one with me in the role of a scheming sister instead of the woman who had stayed up nights sewing for her exhausted baby. Jordan called at once, his voice was low. They're not bluffing, they want to make an example. It felt like a physical blow. The envelope had not just words, it had a threat wrapped in procedure. The message was simple. We will make this expensive and unbearable for you. We will make you afraid of the cost of standing up. They threatened to sue me and Tessa, and the implied promise was clear. We will drag this out until you have nothing left. The legal language is designed to sound impartial, like a scale balancing facts and law, but it read to me like a verdict before a trial. They had turned my truth into a crime I didn't know how to defend against. I sat on the floor in my small kitchen, the packet splayed like a fan, and felt a rage so sharp it almost made me laugh. Then the laughter stopped and the ache began. Reading those pages brought every painful whisper from my history back to life. Mom's voice at the dinner table, "You're being so difficult," sounded like a verdict. Dad's text, "Don't ruin the family name over your pride," echoed like a judge's sentence. Caleb's casual dismissal, "An idea isn't the same as building a business," sang through the margins of the lawsuit. The legal threat was a formal version of everything I had been told my whole life. That my voice didn't matter, that my work was small, that my pain could be bought off. I thought of Tessa, who had trusted me with that deck. I thought of the risk she'd taken by contacting me. The envelope had folded her into my mess. I felt sick with guilt. I had wanted to protect her. Now we were both named targets. Jordan sat across from me in a chair that had seen better days. He rubbed his forehead and then looked up. "We have options," he said, but even he sounded tired. "We can fight, we can push back, we can go to Discovery and make them explain everything, but this is going to cost. It's going to take time. They've got deeper pockets, Mara." Time and deep pockets were the two things I did not have. I had a job that paid enough to keep a roof above our heads and a daughter who needed soccer cleats and a dentist appointment. I had bills that never took a break. The thought of being bankrupted by a fight that would drag on for years made my chest tighten. The plan we'd made turned into a risk that might not be survivable. I remember sitting on my floor that night, the packet of papers beside me like a small, hateful monument. I thought of every late night stitching the mat, of the tiny hand in the photo, and the way my world had been quiet and small and honest. And then I thought of the sound of Mia's laugh, of her little sneakers slapping on the pavement when she ran around the park. Those small things were the only currency I had that mattered. I almost called Jordan and told him to take the offer. I almost hung a white flag from the balcony, but then my phone buzzed. It was Nora. She'd texted a picture, Mia at the park, yellow raincoat, huge grin, mud on her knees. The photo was a bright, messy square of joy. I held that photo against the legal papers like a talisman. The fear didn't disappear, but the edges of it changed. I had started this for more than revenge. I had started it because someone once told me to be quiet, and I was tired of teaching my daughter to be quiet too. If this fight meant losing my family or my savings, then so be it. If it meant the story of my work could finally be told, then maybe it was worth the risk. Jordan outlined a path. We would answer the cease and desist. We would refuse to be bullied into silence. We would push back against the lawsuit, not with bravado, but with careful steps. He promised to pace things so the financial hit would be as manageable as possible. We would take the discovery process if it came to that and force them to show their cards. But even with a plan, the moment felt like an abyss. The papers were clear, they were coming for me. They were going to try to make me small by making everything I had into a legal mess. I lay awake that night, Mia breathing softly in the next room, and thought of the long fight ahead. I realized I had placed my daughter's future against the reputation of a man who would rather ruin me than say my name. It was humbling and terrifying. I had wanted to burn the bridge, but I hadn't expected the fire to try to burn down my house. For the first time, the whole thing felt precarious. The lawyer's threat was no longer abstract. It was a real, heavy net being thrown over our life, yet even with the fear there was a stubborn ember I could not stamp out. It was small, and it was stubborn, and it lived in the memory of Mia's hand curled around the ribbon in the photo, the exact proof that had started all of this. I held that ember and made a promise to myself in the dark. I would not teach her to be small. If that meant we lost family dinners forever, if that meant we went through a long legal nightmare, then I would shoulder that with my head up. The rest, my savings, my comfort, could be rebuilt. A name on a box could not be taken back. The next morning I called Tessa. Her voice was thin, frightened, and steady all at once. "They've named me," she said quietly. "They say I'm part of some extortion scheme." "No," I told her. "You did the right thing. You saved me." Her silence was both relief and guilt. We both knew we were standing on thin ice. We answered the cease and desist with a refusal. We filed a short response to the draft lawsuit that said, in plain language, we had evidence and we would defend ourselves. It was not heroic, it was practical. It was the only sound thing we could do. After that, life became a weird blur of calls, forms, and quiet moments where I watched Mia play and tried not to imagine the worst. I paid attention to small things: Nora bringing over a casserole, Jordan pacing and making lists, Mia asking why I couldn't go to Ava's next party. I learned to live with fear the way you learn to live with a persistent deep ache, by naming it and then moving on. The envelope still sat in my apartment like a second shadow. But every so often I would pull out Nora's picture and stare at it until the edges of that fear softened. They had tried to make me disappear with a file of legal threats. They had tried to turn my life into the kind of slow, expensive war that chews through ordinary people. For a while, it almost worked. But every night when Mia fell asleep, I laid next to her for a while and felt the small, stubborn ember grow. It would not be easy. There would be days of exhaustion and doubt and loss. But in the end, the thing that had started this, my little handmade mat and a photograph printed at a pharmacy kiosk 8 years ago, was the proof I needed to keep going. Jordan sent their response with a single sentence: "We will see you in court and we look forward to the discovery process." It felt like a dare, calm and small on the page, but it did its job. 2 days later, their team blinked. They asked for one last settlement meeting, their office, their rules. The conference room smelled like stale coffee and expensive cologne. The table was a long, polished slab that reflected the overhead lights. Caleb sat with his jaw tight, a man who had practiced looking confident even when he wasn't. 2 lawyers sat beside him in identical suits, one thumbing a legal pad like a prop. Across from me, Jordan had piles of photocopies, his laptop open, a calm I felt like leaning on. I felt a hum of something between my ribs, fear mixed with a steady, hot purpose. They started polite, the kind of corporate politeness that feels like a mask. Caleb's lead lawyer opened with a fat folder and a practiced tone about how this could all be resolved amicably. He offered a number that was markedly higher than the first check. There was a glossy non-disclosure agreement placed on the table like a napkin, cold and final. "A generous, final offer," he said. "We want to avoid all this messy publicity." My hand found the photo of Mia's dress in my bag before I even meant to reach for it. It felt like a talisman. I had printed it out the night before, not the investor slide, but the simple, honest picture of a little blush dress hanging on a hook in our apartment. I slid it across the table so everyone could see the soft pink and the little satin sash, something ordinary that cost me 3 months' savings and should have cost nothing at all in dignity. "I will speak," I said, before anyone could shape their words into a new trap. My voice came out clear, tighter than I wanted, but steady. "This is not about a check. This was never just about money." Caleb shifted in his seat and avoided my eyes. The lawyer's pen clicked. Jordan watched quietly. "You built a company on neutral colors," I said, and I felt a small, ridiculous satisfaction at how the sound of it matched the feel of the first invitation. Beige, gray, cream. Colors meant to blend in. You put a filter over a photo of my child and made the world believe it was yours. You sold the nights I spent sewing to other people and let everyone call you brilliant while they erased me. I put the investor slide on the table next, the uncropped photo with the little hand on the ribbon in the corner. There was no theatrics in me, no sob story, just flat facts. That photo is mine, that design is mine, I want my name on the product, I want a fair payment for what I created, I want royalties. And I do not sign anything that erases the truth. The lead lawyer's face didn't show anything, but I saw the little micro-motions, the quick consult with his colleague. They offered a bigger sum again. A lunch of numbers they assumed I would eat because I had bills and a child and a small life that could be quietly fixed with a check. They kept the non-disclosure agreement like a final ring on their finger. Jordan spoke softly then, and his voice had a calm I needed. "Those are her terms," he said. "No NDA, they either accept in full or we proceed." Caleb's mouth worked. He fumbled with a paper cup of coffee as if it could give him courage. For a moment I thought he might say sorry, for a moment I thought he might fold and do the decent thing. He didn't. Instead he snapped. Not at me, but at the idea that someone had shown him what he'd done. "Fine," he barked, louder than the room needed. It was not a surrender, it was a demand to end humiliation. Give her what she wants. Make it stop. There was a tense, ugly quiet. His lawyers shifted into motion, but they weren't moving with the surety they'd had before. A deal was sketched out in those next minutes. The numbers were negotiated, not as an act of contrition, but as a business problem being solved. Jordan made sure the key parts were spelled out simply. An upfront payment, a small percentage of future sales for a limited time, and my name listed as co-creator on the packaging and on any filings going forward. No blanket erasure, no gag orders that would let them pine the truth into silence. They tried to frame it as a partnership. I kept the terms firm. My voice did not waver when I said, "My name on the box, my name on the paperwork." That is non-negotiable. They wrote it down, they made it official in pencil and signatures. It wasn't the world-altering confession I'd wanted. It was a business sheet with clauses and initials, and it bore my name. When the papers were signed, Caleb gave me a look I had known my whole life, the look men give when they want something and think they have it again. It held almost no warmth, but he had named it. He had put my name where it had always belonged. That was mine, and in that moment it felt like victory. We walked out differently. I didn't have a parade or applause. There was only the hum of traffic and the small, stubborn fact that my name would now be printed where people could see it. Jordan squeezed my shoulder in the parking garage. "You did it," he said. I felt tired in a way I hadn't before, as if the fight had emptied me and filled me at once. The settlement money hit my account a week later. The number was real and immediate and changed my life in practical ways. I paid off $18,400 in student loans and credit card debt. I watched the balances drop to zero, and at the same time something in me lightened like a breath finally released. I fixed the leaky sink in the kitchen that had been dripping for so long I had almost learned to sleep with it. I bought a new set of warm winter boots for Mia and the bright blue coat with sleeves long enough for both this year and next. Paying off the debt wasn't glamorous, but it felt like stitching the torn seam of our lives back together. We replaced the old mattress topper on Mia's bed, and I bought a box of brand new pencils and a fresh sketchbook for myself. For the first time in years, I ordered something for me that wasn't a necessity: an extra spool of thread, a new needle case. Small things, but they meant a life that could keep going without the constant, grinding worry. Caleb released a statement through his public relations firm. It was glossy and practiced. A note about family misunderstandings and his joy in officially partnering with his sister, an early collaborator. It wasn't the truth, not all of it, but my name was on the press release. That was the thing I had fought for. The world would see my name and ask a question I had never expected to be asked. Who is Mara Collins? The fallout rippled in small ways that were satisfying. A few sponsors paused deals as they did their own checking. A major retailer delayed the placement while someone looked into the origin story. Investors started asking awkward questions. The house where Caleb built a life of careful beige suddenly seemed to have cracks where the foundation had been. I didn't celebrate by watching the news or scrolling through commentary. I took Mia to the park and let her run until she was breathless, and then we came home and made pancakes. The new equilibrium settled in like winter light. We had less tension under our roof because I didn't have to hide the truth anymore. We had money that covered 1,000 small emergencies. I had the relief of not spending every waking moment calculating how to pay for the next bill. It was practical freedom. The kind of relief you feel when a hole in your pocket is finally patched. But there were costs. My phone didn't ring with calls from mom or dad. I saw pictures of them on social media from a family trip, smiling under a perfect sky without an empty chair for me. It stung. It hurt in the way that salt stings a wound, clean and sharp. The knowledge that they had chosen distance over truth gnawed at me in private moments. I missed the fantasy of a family that would stand up for its own. That grief was real and slow. We moved a few hours away to a smaller city with better schools and fewer people who cared about what color anyone wore to a party. Our new apartment was small, but it had a balcony where I planted bright pink flowers that looked like little flags of defiance. The neighborhood had kids on bikes and a library with a real children's section. Mia came home from her first day at the new school wearing a unicorn t-shirt and announced she had already made 2 friends. She wasn't choosing clothes with caution anymore. She picked out the brightest sneakers she could find and ran like she meant it. I thought often about the small things I bought with the settlement: a coat that fit, a fixed sink, a stitch kit. They weren't dramatic, they were ordinary, steady repairs. But they mattered. They built a life where Mia didn't have to stand in the kitchen to be useful, where she could go to a birthday party in glitter and not be sent away. Caleb's public non-apology hung in the air like a forced apology in a play, but my name was on the box now, and that made a difference. Women at the playground would ask, in that quiet way people ask about ordinary miracles, "Who made that?" And then pause when they saw my name. That pause was justice, small and human. It was the kind of thing that would not fix everything, but it would let the truth live on the label where anyone could read it. The cost was that I had no family as I had once pictured it. The contrast was brutal. On one hand, a fractured, carefully curated mansion with its cracks. On the other hand, our small kitchen with a fixed sink, a shelf of new pencils, and a child who felt seen. One was brittle and staged, meant to look perfect. The other was messy and warm, and ours, I would not pretend it was simple. There were nights when the trade-off felt cruel. But when Mia curled up with me and told me about the friend who liked rockets or the girl who loved math, I felt something steady and sure. I had chosen truth over ease. I had taught my daughter that being seen was worth the cost. And that lesson, more than any check or headline, felt like the truest kind of victory. The thick envelope arrived on a plain Tuesday, like everything from that house always did, polished, deliberate, trying to pretend nothing had broken. It was heavy with gold foil, the calligraphy looping like a polite apology that wasn't an apology. For a second, I felt a ridiculous urge to open it like it might be a map back to how things used to be. Then I remembered the way Mia had been walked into the kitchen, the way she'd stood there handing napkins while Ava and the other kids played. Mia found it first. She was helping me unload groceries at the counter, and her small fingers slid under the edge. She looked up at me, a question in her face I didn't want to answer with words. "Is this from them?" she asked, and there was no hurt in her voice, more curiosity, like a child checking if a bee would sting. I nodded. She didn't open it. She held the envelope like a fragile seashell, then she ripped it in half deliberately, the way a tiny revolutionary might. The gold shattered into 2 neat, angry pieces that fluttered to the floor. She ripped the halves again and dropped the scraps into the recycling bin as if she were announcing we were done with that story. "Can we go to the park instead?" she asked, boots squeaking on the tile. Yes, I said, and the relief that came with the word was quick and bright. The park felt like the right answer. It was messy and loud and had room for glitter and neon and for two people who didn't have to fit anyone else's idea of what they should be. We moved a month later. Not far, just a small city a few hours away with a real children's library and a neighborhood bakery that remembered Mia's name. The apartment was smaller than the one we'd left, but it had a corner by a window where the light would catch whatever I put on the desk. I bought a box of new pencils, fat ones the kind kids like, and set a fresh sketchbook in the corner. On the same desk, I placed the first new Soothe Nest box that bore my name, printed neatly under the logo. Seeing my name there made my throat tight in a way that was almost like laughing. That afternoon, we walked to the park and Mia ran ahead, glitter in her hair, sneakers squeaking on the path. I sat on a bench and opened my sketchbook. My first lines were shaky, then sure. I drew the mat again, not as a thing stolen or fought over, but as the thing it had always been, a small, honest answer to sleepless nights. For the first time, I was designing for me and for Mia, and there was no drawer where those drawings could be hidden.